I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, an oral history series sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia and Young Harris College. It's Wednesday, November 15th, 2017, and we're on the campus of the University of Georgia with our guest, Roland Mcelroy. Welcome, Roland.
Thank you, Bob. Glad to be with you.
Well, Roland, you're a native Georgian, but you were almost born in Florida.
That's right. That's right. 10 miles from the Florida line. It's about as far south as you'd care to go in the state of Georgia without stepping into Florida, which I'm not sure is really part of the South anyway. It's quite a mixture down there.
What was it like growing up in Quitman?
Well, growing up in Quitman is like growing up in most small towns in Georgia, of which there are very many, in the range of, say, a population of 5,000 to 7, many with 3 to 5. And my dad used to say, he was a Presbyterian minister, if you put all the South Georgia towns, names of all of them in a hat and threw it up against a map and worked with it from there on, you wouldn't know you'd been in a different place. They were all pretty much the same. But so growing up as a number 6 of 9 children to a Presbyterian minister who aspired to have a dozen because he'd read or seen the movie Cheaper by the Dozen, was an interesting experience, to say the least.
Well, when you finished school there, you considered a college career, and you chose the University of Georgia.
Right.
What plans at that point had you made for your life?
Good question. I had spent 5 years in radio broadcasting as a high school student. I thought maybe radio was the field that I would be most comfortable with as a career. But I think somewhere in the back of my mind, I was always interested in politics. I remember, and I write about this in this current book, The Best President the Nation Never Had, I write about Bill Bodenhammer, who ran for governor against Ernest Vandiver, in 1958, I think it was. I remember him coming to the radio station. I was probably 14 or just 15 years old at the time. And he came in like a firestorm, rushing into the station. There was nobody there but me. Bill Bodenhammer slapped his hand in mine and said, "I'm Bill Bodenhammer, runs for governor." And it was all like one word. And that was my first contact with anybody who thought they ought to be elected to a public office. But there was something about that interested me. And I remember watching the Democrats convention of 1956, I think it was, when Chet Huntley and David Brinkley were hosting for the first time on television one of the conventions. And John Pastore, no wait, that was in '64, but I watched all the conventions and had even though I was interested, I had no idea that I would ever end up working in any political affiliation whatsoever. And so, it goes back to all of that. I guess my ideas about what I was going to do with my career began to slowly change.
Did you participate in campus politics at the university?
I did not. I was a member of the Demosthenian Literary Society. We debated each other all the time. Hamilton Jordan was a candidate for president of the senior class during the time I was here, and I'm not sure whether it was my freshman or sophomore year when he did that, and I just knew him in passing, and I thought how wonderful that would be. I wonder what it takes to think about running for president of anything, and even particularly the senior class. But he ran. I think he won that year, and I always, even though I was doing other things, I think some part of me was still always thinking about this interesting world out there of politics. It seemed like a magical sphere of activity that was going on. And And I was sort of drawn to it. What causes people to do it? Why do they get in it? What's it all about? What good is it? What do they do? I think I was always interested in that. And then when Sam Nunn came along, and suddenly the opportunity was there. I never envisioned that would ever happen.
Tell us how you first met Sam Nunn.
I met Sam Nunn in Jody Powell's office in Atlanta when Jody was press secretary to Carter in May of 1971. I think that's right. And they were looking for someone to help Sam Nunn, who I still had not met, run the Goals for Georgia program, which was one of Carter's pet projects, an exercise in participatory democracy, he called it. Give the people a chance to tell us, the elected officials, what their priorities for spending would be if they were sitting in the governor's chair. And so we did that. But you know, J.W. Fanning, who was vice president for services at the University of Georgia, and I knew each other. He was a great fellow. And he, I think, had watched that little ETV program that I hosted during my graduate years, I believe, on the Georgia ETV network. He had seen it. It was called Georgia Land. I was the successor to Ronnie Stevens, who did that program for many, many years. I didn't do nearly as good a job as he did. But I think J.W. had seen me do that program, and he knew me personally. And Jody Powell had called him that May morning and said, we need somebody right now. Somebody can come over here immediately and help do the public relations work on this thing, help the governor get his message out about it. And so I went over to talk to him about it, and he wanted to know if I could start that day. And I said, well, maybe I need to have lunch first, but then we can get into it. And about that time, this fellow from Perry walked in the back of the room, walked into Jody's office, and introduced himself to me. And when Jody told him that he had just hired me and that I was ready to start, he said, good, I've got a list of things for you to do. And he handed me a sheet of paper. I told that to somebody who's associated with him today, and she laughed and she said, you know, he's always had a list of things for you to do, for any staffer who works with him to do. And I think that was always the case. But that was my first meeting with him. And we had good chemistry, you might say, from the start.
Mm-hmm. Joe Frank Harris loves to tell the story about Joe Frank was Sam Nunn's seatmate.
Yeah, right.
And he loves to tell the story about Sam coming in one morning and saying, well, I've made up my mind. I'm going to run for the Senate.
Oh.
And so Joe Frank said, oh, yeah? What district? Who's your senator? And Sam immediately caught on and said, I don't mean the state Senate.
Yeah.
I mean the United States Senate.
Right. And
from
what Joe Frank say?
Well, Joe Frank was, a little taken aback.
Yeah.
But Joe Frank, being the kind of fellow he is, I'm sure immediately pledged his support to Sam.
You know, that is it's a great story, and it offers interesting insight into Sam Nunn's thoughts at that time. So many people like Joe Frank at that time were just telling him, no, don't do that. Don't waste your time doing that. You're going to lose. You're going to be running against the governor's appointed senator, and who knows who else will be in it. Sanders may be in it. Lester Maddox may be in it. You've got no chance whatsoever. And even though so many people told him that, it would have discouraged most other humans. It did not. He had a passion for it that could not be denied. He was going to run for that slot. He wanted to serve in Congress, either in the House or the Senate, in the worst way. He wanted to be there. And so he could pursue that career at the federal level. There was nothing going to dissuade him. And it's sort of the opposite of what happened in I guess 1988, and again as late as 2008, when people were still encouraging him to run, and he was feeling the pull pretty strong then, even though he'd already decided he wasn't going to do it. I talked to him one day, and when the heat was on him particularly warmly, to run, and I could see the passion wasn't there that we were talking about a moment ago in 1971, 72. I said, this is the opposite, isn't it, of 1972? And he said, yes.
Well, let's talk about that race.
Yeah.
Let's talk about, first of all, it was an uphill battle. We all knew that. You had a former governor.
Right.
You had a well-known state treasurer.
Right.
You had 13, oh gosh, I don't know how many others. I think the total of 15 in the race.
14 others, that's right.
Yeah, 14 others.
A former congressman, Ed
Former
Wheeler.
congressman.
Yeah.
Yes. And from that emerged Sam Nunn, who, strangely enough, to a lot of people, got into a runoff
Yeah.
with the incumbent,
Right.
who was David Gambrell,
Right.
appointed by Governor Carter,
Right.
therefore having everybody assume that Governor Carter was supporting him for election. And you had former Governor Vandiver,
That's true.
who had been governor and well known, and but Senator Nunn came in second and got into a runoff with Gambrell.
Mm-hmm.
And take it from there.
Well, it's surprising that he did as well as he did on one hand, but when you realize that the people had not completed their evaluation of appointed Senator Gambrell at the time that campaign got underway, and they were beginning to look around to see if he was the best or if there was something better to select from. But in the end, you know, Nunn, at the very end of this crazy race, which he could not win, he had the support on one side of Coretta Scott King, and over here, George Wallace. Mm-hmm. He had the support of Julian Bond and former Governor Lester Maddox and former Governor Marvin Griffin. Mm-hmm.
And Governor Sanders.
Absolutely, that's right. And so it was an interesting coalition that spanned the complete breadth of the political spectrum out there. And I'm telling you that end story to get back to the beginning. Those people, I think, were all looking for the same person. It turns out so were the voters in 1972. Mm-hmm. Those people across that spectrum were looking for someone who would listen to them and then would go to Washington and read, learn, think, and then exercise his best judgment on their behalf when he went to cast a vote, and then, most importantly, after that was over, explain to them in clear layman's language why he took the position he did. And he did so in a way that they not only could understand, but could respect, so that even if they didn't change their mind and agree with him, even if they left the room or left talking with him and still disagreeing, they respected his position, and thus he retained their trust as a result of that. So when you go back to 72, the average voter, I think today as well as back then, is still looking for that kind of person that they can talk to and who will listen, think, exercise their best judgment. You know, you can do that, but if you can't explain why you voted in terms that make sense and for moving the republic forward, then you still haven't done your job. You still haven't done your job. The most incredible thing that happened, I think, in that campaign, he did something that was his own initiative, his own thought, that went completely contrary to conventional political wisdom at that time, and I've ever heard anybody do. He came in one day and he said, you know, I've been on the road. He announced in March, and by middle of May, he said, I've been on the road now for 2 months. This campaign has not scratched. I'm still going into towns around Georgia, and people are saying, Sam, who? Who are you? What are you running for? He said, I have no traction whatsoever in this campaign. So he made a decision to spend what was left of the money, small amount of money, in his campaign treasury to buy radio and television ads on stations around the state. He asked everybody what they thought. I told him I thought everybody has to save their money. You want to put it all there at the end when people are starting to make up their minds. He said, it's going to be too late. If I don't do it now, and we're talking about May and the primaries in August, if I don't do it now, there won't be any campaign to save in August or late July. And so he did it. I mean, I have to give him all the credit for that. He went down in Atlanta to one of the studios, and the ad agency set him up on a stool with a black backdrop behind him. The audience could only see, just him sitting on the stool and his face. And as he spoke directly and candidly into the camera began to slowly zoom in on him until it was just his head, and not even the shoulders, I think, were showing at the very end. And he stared the camera in that classic way he does without even blinking an eye for a moment. It looks like he's reading something. He's just staring stone-faced into the camera, but talking in very serious terms, plain terms for the average voter. And son of a gun, he connected. It made a big difference. He started going around the state. People would say, I saw you on TV. I heard what you said. I like it. Or I saw you on TV. I don't like it. And then he would explain why he said, that sort of way. And town after town after that, he would go in and come away with a solid number of people who are now beginning to think seriously about voting for him. Mm-hmm. That's the most fascinating part of that history that I remember. But you're right. Hal Gulliver told him he was crazy as hell to think about running against the governor's machine,
Yeah.
Even Carl Vinson, his great uncle, told him he was nuts to do it, that this wasn't going to be successful. I mean, everybody told him it was a waste of time. And fortunately, I didn't know anything about politics, so I couldn't tell him that, and I just said, let's go do it. And
there was something about Sam that was very appealing.
Very what?
Appealing.
Oh, appealing. Oh.
But I think that election was the perfect storm.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Well, the thing about it was that I was a voter. I was very active in politics. I had known these people. I knew them all. And yet I wound up not only voting for, but heavily supporting Sam Nunn and working hard for Sam Nunn in that campaign. Yeah. And I often wondered, I looked around and I said, gosh, I worked with Governor Vandiver, and we went through all of this turmoil together, but yet there's something about Sam Nunn that makes me think that he is what we need right now up in Washington.
I just thought in March, I hope we have enough time to help the people of Georgia discern in him the same qualities that you saw and that his family and his friends saw. There was some doubt in the minds of a lot of people whether we had enough time to do that. But he was an extraordinary public servant. I think that he understood that elective office was all about public service. And a lot of candidates who think they'd make good presidents, good governors, good senators, don't start off with an understanding that when they take these jobs, if the people give them that trust, the duty is to perform a public service because they are a public servant, not a self-servant, but supposed to be dedicated to the common good. It sounds like it'd be common and universally understood, but it appears that not everybody enters the fray with that understanding.
Let's get back for a minute to Roland Mcelroy. What was your first real job?
I got my first job at 9 years of age, and I've been working ever since, I tell people. I was hired to be the yard boy for a couple of old ladies, unreconstructed ladies from students of the Civil War. I remember that most clearly, and I cut the grass and raked the leaves for about 4 years, but it was a good living. We didn't pay Social Security, but it was a good living.
Okay. Well, I guess we all had odd jobs when we were young. I can remember some that I wish I never had. But, unfortunately, you do it.
Yeah, all of mine were a learning experience, I hope.
Getting back for a minute now and I hope you don't mind jumping back and forth.
It's okay.
We forgot to mention that former Governor Ellis Arnold also supported Senator Nunn in that race.
That's true. That's true.
And he was very helpful with the legal profession, particularly in Atlanta.
You know, you make me think of something else, and that is that he was very helpful. Ellis Arnold was very helpful with the legal profession. You're absolutely correct. In Perry, Sam Nunn's hometown, there were people around there that were so thoroughly committed to him that regardless of their profession, their vocation, or because of it, I guess, they would contact their counterparts in other counties, towns around the state. That made a huge difference. These were people who knew Sam Nunn well, some since birth, very well, committed to him, and that transferred to their counterparts in other parts of the state. They wrote letters to them from the beginning, and we went everywhere we went. We'd say so-and-so, we'd run into somebody who'd say so-and-so from Perry wrote me or called me the other day about you, and I've been wanting to meet you. That's the kind of thing that is extremely important in that race, and I think in every race.
Yes. So now we're in this runoff with between Senator Nunn and the incumbent David Gambrell.
Yes.
It was rumored that Governor Vandiver had a conversation with Senator to-be Nunn, and they agreed that whichever got into the runoff, the other would support. And that Governor Vandiver sent 20,000 letters to his friends around the state asking them to support Senator Nunn. I'm sure that was helpful.
It was, but boy, that was really a tough time. I think Vandiver was very disappointed that he didn't make the runoff, and I think he was very hurt by the experience. Maybe that's the best word for it. He just felt very disappointed and very hurt. His endorsement of Nunn in the runoff did not come immediately. It was slow to come, as a matter of fact, but he did ultimately send out 20,000 letters on Senator Nunn's behalf. But there was not an agreement between the two. At least I don't recall it. I think I would have known about it. But that's not to say those kinds of conversations couldn't have occurred unbeknownst to anyone but the two parties involved. But I never heard anything about there being an agreement between the two, and I have to say that I think it sounds a little bit unlike Senator Nunn to say in advance what he would do when the outcome is known on that. I have no reason to believe he wouldn't have endorsed the other way as well, but I don't remember there being any agreement. But yes, but Vandiver's endorsement and those letters made a huge difference with his people.
Well, Senator Nunn had a clean slate insofar as political philosophy is concerned.
Yeah.
He was not tabbed as a liberal,
right,
or as a conservative, or as a middle of the roader.
Right.
He was actually unknown as far as political philosophy was concerned.
Yeah.
Don't you think that was helpful?
I do. I think it was very helpful. He was what I called a discipline constant, and he was devoted to intellectual honesty and the highest standards of ethical behavior. That above all else. I mean, he wasn't governed by party orthodoxy. That was not as important to him as the best, arriving at the best decision, solving problems and arriving at the best decision.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people like that. When they discern those qualities in him, they liked it.
Yeah. Well, actually, there were no real issues in the campaign because all of the candidates, had the same position.
Pretty much.
On most of the
pretty
concerns of the country at the time.
Right.
And the state.
Yeah.
So I guess you could say that it could be defined as a popularity contest.
Well, I'm not sure, Bob. I would agree with that because you had some pretty well-known names in there and in that competition. The former, Vandiver and Bill Burson, the state treasurer, and Ed Wheeler, the former congressman. You had some names that were fairly well known to the voters before that thing got started. And I don't know.
But there was baggage.
There was what? Oh, there was baggage in just about all those cases, wasn't there?
Except for Senator Nunn.
Yeah, that's right.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
Yeah, I see.
Is that he didn't have to defend himself against criticism for something that had happened in his career.
Yeah,
as the other candidates did.
That's true. He was the Mr. Clean Jeans in the contest, if you will.
That's exactly right.
But I don't know that I've ever considered the simple popularity of the candidates as a reason for it to happen. I wouldn't say it was that he was popular, but that he was respected and his views valued for the credibility they offered. And how you define that ultimately with popularity, I guess the end result is the vote. But candidates need not to be, because if we went on popularity, if Oprah Winfrey ran, or you'd have to say, she might have a really good chance. But is she a public servant? Some of the others, the celebrities they talk about, I don't know. I doubt it. If they don't talk about public service to begin with, what are they doing in a political campaign? Helping to protect the republic. Do they understand what that's all about? I mean, I think people looked at Sam Nunn and said, this is a guy that understands what made us, what keeps us going, and what's important to us in the future. And I know the Republicans say, when McElroy talks, he's doing the same thing. Again, he's trying to deify Sam Nunn. I'm not. I never have. I'm just trying to point out to people he was a little bit different from the other politicians. And that's what people saw and they liked.
Well, that's true, obviously.
Yeah.
24 years worth.
He was, listen, on defense and foreign policy, when he walked into the Senate, he would probably deny this if I say it, but I think it was true. He carried 15 or 20 votes. Other senators respected him so much, I saw them do it. They'd stand in the back of the chamber and wait till he voted on those kinds of issues and then walk up and vote with him. Mm-hmm. And hardly any of them ever made a mistake when they did that. Anyway.
Okay. So now we're at the point where you're in Washington. Describe for us your role in the administration of Sam Nunn as a United States Senator.
I was his press secretary for the first 9 years he was there. And then when Richard Ray left to run for Congress, his administrative assistant, he asked me to come and serve as the AA, or the administrative assistant, the title that was later changed among all the offices up there to chief of staff. And and that's what I did until I left in 1986. Frankly, I had decided by that time that clearly he wasn't going to run for president. And I thought, well, maybe I ought to try my hand at doing something else around town. But once an employee of Sam Nunn, we always said in the office, you're always an employee of Sam Nunn. And even after I left, I would get calls from him in the middle of the night sometime when he had a speech the next morning. And I remember one time in particular, he said, I'm speaking to the Georgia broadcasters in the morning, and I need to talk to them about what was that issue back in 1975 that they were interested in. And this was some years after I'd left his office. But you were likely to get a phone call at any time of the day or night if you were ever associated with him in any way. And because he valued the opinion of everyone and some in particular. If he thought they had expertise, you were likely to get a phone call.
Several times he was considered a possible candidate for vice president.
Yeah, not likely to happen. Not.
But he was considered.
He was considered. Different ones considered him. But he enjoyed being in the Senate, and he is not a number two. He would probably have only, I say this without having him here to pull on my elbow or anything, that he was interested, if he interested at all, he'd be interested in going for number one. But I don't think Sam Nunn would have been comfortable being the number two guy, the guy sitting around waiting for number one to die with a heart attack or something, or attending funerals of heads of state overseas.
Riding elephants.
Right. No, I don't think, I can't see him doing that. Could not see it then or now.
Do you think he could ever have gotten the Democratic nomination for president?
Yeah, I think he could, but it would have been extremely hard. He once said to me that it would be difficult for him to get the nomination because in traveling around the country, he would be asked to say things that he didn't believe in, make comments that did not fit his character. And I think that would have been, I think as a result of that, it would have been hard for him to get the nomination. But Carter was not that popular when he left office. And it would have been hard for people to say, well, let's just go with another Georgian. Wasn't that so great the last time? It just wasn't going to. That would have hurt his chances, I think, as well. But boy, there were still plenty of people, even by 2008, there were still plenty of people who thought he ought to run as an independent, not with a major party tag, but as an independent. They were pulling for him or Mike Bloomberg to do that. Mm-hmm. And again, I think in the final analysis, he just decided it wasn't the right thing for him. He was a legislative animal. Those kind of people. And he enjoyed having the hearings and investigating and looking into the details of all these thorny issues that are very, very difficult that nobody else wants to dig into. He enjoyed all of that. And he enjoyed the legislative writing. And when you look at that and see what he did and think about it, you understand why he really wasn't interested in being the president. He was fine with being the counsel, and he was to about 6 or 7 presidents and to other heads of state around the world on certain foreign matters and defense matters.
What was his relationship with the leadership of the party in the Senate?
Well, generally, you mean over the years? And
yeah.
I think his relationship with the leadership in the Senate was good, but they understood him from the start. They understood he was not going to be an automatic vote. And no president ever considered him in their hip pocket. Carter, Reagan, anybody. They knew this was a guy who was going to take every issue separately, independently, and evaluate it. So you got to understand that the environment of the Senate changed over years. When he first came there, Mike Mansfield Montana was the majority leader. And very early on, he had a conversation with Mansfield, and he said, Senator, how do you determine whose voices are going to be heard in the Senate and what issues are going to be raised, and particularly who's going to have the floor to discuss these issues? And is it based on seniority or just strictly or what? That was an interesting question that he asked him. And Mansfield responded by saying, Sam, I consider 100 senators as equals. All have equal opportunity to express their views. All their views have merit and should be considered. And not one has a higher position than the other. Yes, seniority prevails, of course, when you're choosing chairman of committees and assigning room numbers and that sort of thing. But Mansfield said that, and I think he truly meant that. He followed that everybody's position had merit and was worthy to be heard. That was his modus operandi every day. But you don't. By the time Sam Nunn, I think, left the Senate in '97, January of '97, that atmosphere had changed, and so working with the majority leader of either party became a greater challenge. But I think for him, they always knew, regardless, that he was going to approach everything the same way as he did the first day. He really was a constant. Sam Nunn is what he is. He was the same on the last day as he was on the first day. And the leadership knew it, and they worked with him.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, he was great friends with Senator Robb.
Chuck Robb, yeah, of Virginia.
Right.
Right. Chuck Robb became head of the Democratic Leadership Council after Senator Nunn gave it up.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about that.
I'm sorry?
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Democratic Leadership
Council.
Council, yeah. Explain that to us and the reason for it.
Well, the Republicans today in 2017 probably be well suited if they were well advised to follow the same sort of thought. Sam Nunn and Chuck Robb and Lawton Childs were out in San Francisco in 1984, sitting in the back of the convention hall when they were nominating Walter Mondale to be the Democratic nominee for president. They had just been through the process of nominating George McGovern in 1972, and of course Humphrey in '68, and we'd also been through the Carter business of '76, and lost to his loss to Reagan in '80. The party had, in the view of that group, sitting in the back of the convention hall, listening to Mondale talk, had concluded that the Democratic Party had swung too far to the left, way too far for the average person, out of touch with the average person, and not following typical Democratic principles. They just thought it had swung too far. It was time to move it back towards the center, because most presidents govern from the center, or at least they used to. They tried to, and try to move themselves as close to it as possible soon after the inauguration. But they did not have much faith that the party was going to do that year, and had begun swinging way too far to the left. So they decided to establish this Democratic Leadership Council, which would be an assist to the party, not take the place of the party or leadership or anything like that, but just develop positions on issues that were more centrist-oriented, more in line with the thinking of the average voter out there. And that was the whole purpose. Paul Kirk, who was the chairman of the Democratic National Committee at the time, came over to the Senate to meet with him. And I was in one of those meetings. I don't know how many were held, but I remember a luncheon that we had with Kirk in Senator Nunn's Capitol office. And Kirk said, give us a little bit of time. We're working hard to bring the Democratic Party back to the center. And I just need a little more time to do that. Sam Nunn didn't agree to give him any more time. He thought the time was right for this Democratic leadership initiative and for the effort to bring it back. And it was, indeed, when they established it, and mostly Southern Democratic senators, we still had them in those days, and it was mostly that group, but there were people from some of the western states that were joined as well. I think a couple in the Northeast, perhaps. Not many. But their centrist positions were adopted, a lot of them were adopted by Bill Clinton when he ran in '92, just a few years later. They established the DLC in '85, and Bill Clinton picked up many of their suggested ideas for his campaign and ran successfully on them in 1992. So, I mean, that's how it got started, and it continued for a while after that.
So you were press secretary.
Yes.
Was it a difficult job?
Are you kidding? Oh my gosh. We had, yes, to say the least. It was difficult for a lot of reasons. The issues were always difficult, and the press was always demanding, even, well, perhaps more so today, but back then everything was set up. The technology was different, the deadlines, everything that surrounded it were different, but the pressures were very much the same, I think. I remember in the first 3 months, I thought, I'm not going to survive physically this entire thing because the job was all day and well into the night most of the time. And we had the War Powers Act that restricted the war-making ability of the president. Well, Nixon was in office. This was in 1973. It came up in January of '93 and did not get ultimately passed in its final form, I think, until September of that year. Nevertheless, the layout, the first drafts of it were introduced and came out, and Nunn was very much involved in that as a freshman senator from the very beginning. I mean, he wanted to be, he was on the Armed Services Committee. He was going to be in the center of all this defense-related deliberations from that time on. And so he was in the middle of that. So grasping that, getting hands around that was difficult in January of '73. January 22nd of '73, the Supreme Court came down with its Roe v. Wade decision. And so we had all the media to face and work with on that. And the issues were difficult, thorny, and demanding to handle, and from the very first day, and actually never changed. There was always something new every month, and I mean, it's just when you go up there to take those jobs, you really need to be a young person with plenty of energy. I think the older ones, you'd never be able to physically make it if you waited a little bit later in life.
Senator Nunn was chairman of the Armed Services Committee. What was the interrelationship between the office staff and the committee staff?
I think it was good. I think we had a good relationship. We had Arnold Panaro, who had been, this is an example, on the personal staff for Senator Nunn very early on. He was a Marine, decorated Marine from Vietnam, and came to us as an intern in the fall of '73. He had some military background as a result of the Vietnam War, but he learned so much more after he got there and became a trusted staffer, personal staff member, working with me in the press section for a while. But to make a long story short, he later went to the committee as minority staff director, and then when Senator Nunn took over chairmanship, he became the chairman or the staff director for the committee. So it was a personal staff member who went to the committee. I think that's a good example of why the relationship between the committee and the committee staff and the personal staff remained good. And we had a couple of people that ended up doing that. But it was necessary that they work closely together. Their boss was the same.
Well, you became chief of staff. That's the boss.
Yeah.
How did you enjoy that work?
I didn't. Senator Nunn said to me, when he asked me to come up and be the chief of staff, he said, I want you to do this job, but I don't think you're going to like it as much as being press secretary. He was right. I enjoyed the creative opportunity that was available. It was being a press secretary was tough, but there was a creative opportunity to write and to do other things. as the press secretary. As the chief of staff, we had 42 people on the staff. We had 17 to 20 when we got up there. And by the time in 1973, and by the time we got around, say, to 1981, we had about 42 people on the personal staff. Everything from recent college graduates to PhDs in military science and the full range in between. And the staff, they're full of young people, and so they're constantly rolling over and going on to another career in Washington or elsewhere. So constant staff changing and a lot of work to direct staff to support his activities. That's just a continuous process. Not as much fun as being press secretary.
I've been one.
You understand, don't you?
I do. A never-ending task.
Indeed.
Well, you were with Senator Nunn, I guess, throughout his entire career.
Well, no. I was officially on the staff for 15 years, 71 to 86. But as I said, you're always an employee. I never felt I'd ever left the office. I mean, you were always as close as the telephone. So he and I continued a relationship that has lasted through the years. We've working on various projects together, not in any really truly official capacity, but on an ad hoc basis, you might say.
You also served as chief of staff for Senator Robb.
Right.
How did that come about?
He called me one day. His previous staff had gotten him into a bit of trouble with the governor of the state of Virginia, Douglas Wilder, and there had been he'd received some bad press, and Oliver North was thinking about running against him for re-election in 1994. I went to his office in 1991 and stayed with him for a couple of years. By 1995, it was clear to me he was well set to run for re-election and become re-elected. So I went back downtown to 95. I think that's right. Worked for the American Forest and Paper Association for a short while as Government Affairs Director, VP. But Rob was, the staff needed to be calmed. I think they were in somewhat of a panic, thinking he might be in some sort of legal jeopardy as a result of some actions of the staff members that were not on the staff at least anymore. So that was settled, and he quickly reestablished himself as a credible U.S. Senator and became reelected in 1994. And took quite a number. I was there for about 2 years plus, and took about 10 years off my life, I think. But but when a senator's under the cloud of doubt from voters or from the legal system, it's a little tougher to get reelected than it is if you just spend your time, and the staff spends its time dedicated to the public service.
15 years.
Yeah.
Who were some of your favorite senators?
Let's see. Well, some unlikely, some probably likely, but I remember John Pastore very well. He was a short senator from Rhode Island, extremely liberal by Georgia standards today's, and even then. But I remember that he gave the keynote speech at the 1964 convention, and so he was one of the senators I met right away when I first came up there. I ran into him on the subway going over to the Capitol, and I introduced myself to him, and I said, Senator Pastore, that was a great speech you delivered at the Democratic Convention. I watched the whole thing. He said, yeah, you did? And I said, yes. I was on my honeymoon that night and decided to watch the convention. He said, are you crazy? Are you crazy? We laughed about that. He was quite a guy. He was surprised to meet anybody who had actually seen it, much less remembered it. But I had become, unbeknownst to myself, somewhat of a political addict by 1964 and enjoyed watching that and trying to learn a little bit from all of these conventions as they went on. And I was fascinated by all the speeches and the way they were apparently written and crafted, and never realizing I might end up doing some of that one day. And I remember there was a Republican keynote speaker who spent weeks before the convention, his convention, memorizing his speech. Can you imagine that, with everybody depending on teleprompters today? He memorized the speech and rehearsed it out in the, that guy's name, he was in rehearsed it out in the woods up in Minnesota, wherever I think he lived up there. But anyway, that whole process was a fascination to me. Now, you asked me about other senators. Lawton Childs, of course, from Florida, just prince of a gentleman. He was a good friend to Senator Nunn. I think they were close personal friends until Lawton died in Florida, after he went back from the Senate to Florida and became governor down there. But great guy. David Boren, Oklahoma, of course, and even Fritz Hollins, and kind of an irascible individual, but a great fellow to know. But, and now this is going to surprise you, I think, but Barry Goldwater, it's hard not to like that guy. And I understand all the lightning rods that are attached to him that, people have problems with. But he was a ham radio operator, just like I am. We introduced ourselves to each other when we first met in the Senate, and he got me into the Senate Ham Radio Club, and then he took me along with about 6 or 8 other staffers from other offices that were ham radio operators out to Taiwan, when the government there first allowed Americans to come in and get a license for a station and communicate across the world with everybody except the Chinese. We went out there and on a de-expedition for ham radio operators. He was there with us. And then that's unimportant to your audience here, but he, when he found out I was with Sam Nunn, he wanted to know how I got there with him. And then he's told me, he said, the Republicans sent me to Perry, right there in the heart of Sam Nunn country, to campaign on behalf of Fletcher Thompson. And he said, I thought that was crazy as hell to go down there and do that. And he said, everywhere I went, I saw these signs that said, in your heart, it's Sam Nunn. And Nunn's right. And he laughed heartily on that. He thought that was one of the funniest things he'd ever seen. But he was good. He was an honest guy. That's the best thing you can say about him, whether you agreed with his political philosophy or not. And I didn't agree with everything, of course. But he was honest as the day is long. You could rely on him. When he said something, he meant it. He'd do it. Good. He was a good man in that regard.
So you've written a book, The Best President the Nation Never Had. Tell us about your book and why you decided to write it, and why we should read it.
I hope people will read it. I think we need to read it. The title of the book comes from a syndicated column written by George Will about a year after Sam Nunn left the Senate. In that column, and it surprised all of us who knew Sam Nunn, I don't think anybody knew it was coming out, he recounted a lot of the legislative history associated with Senator Nunn and some of the significant accomplishments he'd made, both in the Senate and outside. And he said he has to be listed among the best presidents the nation never had. And I remember making a note of that for some reason, and I don't know why. I didn't intend to write a book at that time. I wasn't thinking about a book. But I think it turned out to be the right title for this. I wanted people to come away with perhaps a renewal of the idea that compromise and cooperation are essential elements of successful governance. This business of taking a hard position on one side and hard position on the other and never letting the two come together and saying that's okay, that's not governing. That's not the way a democratic republic is supposed to operate. We should expect not to agree all of the time. Ben Franklin went to the Constitutional Convention with some ideas for the Constitution that didn't make it. And on the last day when they were getting ready to vote, some of the delegates there thought he was going to vote against it, the Constitution, the final draft. And he said, no, it's going to be an imperfect document. I have some ideas about how to improve it, some edits I would make, some language I would add. But because most of the delegates would disapprove of that, I accept it. I'm not going to walk out in disgust and not be willing to stay here and talk about it and then vote on it. And that's a lot of what you see today. He had an open mind about everything, and he was ready to vote yay for a document that he thought was an imperfect document. Well, that's what happens in government. That's part of government. What's not part of government is this butting heads and never agreeing to disagree and coming together to move the country forward. And we got to get over that. So I'm hoping people will take from this book some thought that cooperation and compromise is important regardless of which party. There was a time there, not too recent past, when compromise was a dirty word in politics, and they wouldn't do it. I remember when Newt Gingrich went up there and put his contract with America out there on the west front of the Capitol. He announced it, and he held it up, and he read the 10 planks in it, and he said, and on these 10 initiatives, we will not compromise. Regardless of the merits of those planks, I said to myself, he's not going to get much accomplished then, because it's all about that. And people need to know that about their government. It works as long as the elected representatives agree to come together. I don't know how we got away from that. It just seems so simple, that the concept is so fundamental to who we are from Ben Franklin's time to now. And I don't know why it's so difficult to get back to that. I hope we will. So that's why I encourage people to read the book.
How long did it take you to write the book?
Not long. Not long. I think I've had it in the back of my head for 10 years. And somebody asked me, did you ever have to stop? Did you have writer's block or anything? No. This is one book that just came out. I've been thinking about it and perhaps making a mental outline of how I would approach this for a long time. So it's out there. It was done fairly quickly.
What's your schedule like when you're writing?
Gosh, I'm writing all the time. I try to write something new every day. When I'm working on this book, I had a couple of other books I was working on quietly, and I'm always doing it. I got a couple of books probably cooking around in my head right now. So it's something. I like to work with an outline, a narrative arc, if you will. It starts just like a novel does. Even a memoir is just like a novel. It's true. A novel is fiction, but a memoir is true. But they both need essentially the same elements. Some point at which they start, the initiating moment, and then the arc that carries through to a moment of epiphany and climax, and then ending over here with some sort of resolution or some statement that leads a reader to understand what your point was and what they should take away from it. And that's what I try to do. Now, once I get that in mind and sit down to write, it's pretty straightforward after that.
I was just thinking the other day, I'm an old newspaper man too.
Yeah.
I was a sports writer.
Yes, I know.
And to me, the most difficult thing in the world is a lead.
That's correct.
And I don't know how many times I've ripped sheets out of a typewriter and thrown them away because
Yeah.
How did you open your book?
Well, I opened the book talking about my youth in Quitman in Brooks County. And then immediately I tried to show the reader how similar it was to Sam Nunn's upbringing in Perry, nearly 200 miles up the road. all these towns in Georgia brought up their children the same way. They're both basically in communities controlled by the Protestant churches, and the schedules of the churches, the schedules of the hometown sports teams. I wanted to indicate that the environment was pretty much the same. The social culture was pretty much the same. The same issues came up, mostly most controversial of which would be what to do about the minorities who lived in the community and how we would get along with them and improve relations. And so I wanted to show that arc, which started there with an understanding of what the two of us were facing in the cultures in our communities, and how it stayed with us through the process of being elected and going to the U.S. Senate and facing challenges there, what to do about the renewal of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and all the issues that came up with that racial narrative, racial evolution through the years, how it stayed with us through the entire time that we were there. So that was something I hope the reader would discern and take away as well as an understanding of the necessary elements for successful representation. That was pretty much it.
I remember doing the Lester Maddox inaugural speech.
Yeah.
Spending, I guess, a full week with Judge Brooks,
Yeah.
Walter Brooks,
Oh, yeah.
well-known speechwriter,
Right.
and Bill Burson,
Yeah.
who was a great speechwriter,
Right.
discussing how to open that speech because of the tenor of the times. You can't. We couldn't decide the best thing to do, and so finally,
Yeah.
and I'm taking credit for this, I said, well, when you look at it politically, the emotions of the people at this moment are many and mixed. And they said, let's use that as the opening line.
Yep.
So we did. Well, it doesn't say anything, but what it did was it got us into writing the speech.
Yeah, the rest of it.
And so that lead, that opening line, the way you approach in the beginning, is to me makes a book.
Well, it does, and when people ask me the best way to start writing a story like the one we're talking about here, I always say, what's the best way to start? The best way to start is to start writing, and write down. The most interesting exercise that you can go through is just start writing what you think it should be, and just write and write and write and write. And when you get through, sit down with it, read it through. Most of the time, the lead you were talking about, the most important part to start with is somewhere down, not at the top, but somewhere in the middle. It might even be here. It might be on the next page. Look for it because it's probably in there. That's the moment of, as I say, like a novel, the exciting moment or the inciting initiative incident, whatever you want to call it, the activating incident, needs to be somewhere near the top that pulls the reader in. Same thing as a novel. Every novelist is trying to, it's the hardest part of the writing exercise to do. I don't know who would disagree with me. I'm just going to say it now. It's the hardest part of it.
Well, you've written several books for children. Where do you get your idea for those books?
I don't know. They just come to me. I've always had a fascination with words and with mixed up words. I guess I got a little bit of Dr. Seuss in me somewhere. To play, I just love to play with the words. And my first children's book was called The Great Miseriddle, and it's about a prospector's unlikely visit to the North Pole in the middle of Christmas preparations. And it's a place where the action is very busy, obviously, And so when you go there, you need to be prepared for the fact that they don't use language like we do. They have to put words together. You know, when you say somebody's smaffing, you mean they're smiling and laughing at the same time. And so putting two words together, a mashup, in English is known as a portmanteau, I think. I think that's what they call it, the French. But it means two together. It's typically a combination of two. When I said the great Miserriddle, that's a mystery, a riddle, and a puzzle, all at the same time. And that's what this story was. In order for the prospector to leave the North Pole, he had to use all of the words, the new words he'd learned up there, in one sentence. And if he could do that, then he might get transported back to the real world that he lived in. And he did it. And that's the way it ends, with a full sentence of these mashed up words. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. My kids, I wrote these stories for my children and now for my grandchildren, so they would have something to remember how crazy their grandfather was. The squiggle and me is also a result of mashing up a lot of words too. You know, I wish I could, in the muddle of a fuddle or something like that. There was one of those, but it's a lot of fun. It's just that's another book you can read to a preschool person who will probably get a giggle or a squiggle out of it, you know. But the stories, let's see, what's the other one? The other one is called Cokie and Me, and it's about a pompous little cat who makes friends eventually with a tuxedo cat, and they finally become fast friends. But they're two totally different animals. One is a tuxedo cat, and the other one is sort of an alley cat, and they become good friends, and that one is about friendship, and hopefully young people will come away with something worthwhile from that as well. So anyway, it's just a fun exercise to do from time to time, and I write them as it hits me, as the inspiration hits me.
Do you want each book to stand on its own, or are you trying to build a body of work with connections between each book?
Well, that's not intentional. If it happens, then it's unintentional, but I usually think of the book standing on its own. And you know, Bob, you spent your life in politics, a lot of it, and I have too. But I spent most of my time was spent writing short pieces, op-eds, 500 words, maybe 750, or occasionally maybe 1,000 words in an op-ed or an opinion column of some sort. A speech might be 5,000 or 8,000 words. I mean, these are all short forms, and they require special skill, no question about that, to do them and to do them regularly and successfully. But when you're talking about a book, a novel, or a memoir, you're talking about 80,000, 100,000 words or more. You know, but that's a different skill involved, required for that. So I've spent a lot of my time in my later years learning how to write the long form. And the novel that I wrote was great preparation for writing the memoir. The memoir is better than it would have been if I hadn't written the novel, because I learned a lot about dialogue tags, for one thing, and how to create a scene and how to put dialogue in it that brought the reader in it. One of the things I wanted to do with the political memoir was to bring the reader into the story so that they could experience it somewhat as I did, and realize that this is a story that could have happened to anyone, and it could have been something they could identify with, because it could have happened to them. I wanted them not to read it as that other thing written by McElroy over here and about the Nunn thing, but this is something that I could have been a part of myself. I could have experienced it, and so I'll read this and it will become part of me. I like that. I like that idea.
Do you ever hear from your readers?
You know, I do, and I've heard a great deal that's encouraging to me. They say they like it very much, the book, and that they like the lessons that they draw from it. And I think that I'm encouraged particularly when they say That's what we need to be getting back to today, that sort of thing. I like that. But I do hear from them. That's important to me.
Do you believe in writer's block?
I don't know that I've ever experienced it, so I have problems with saying yes, but I do understand it. I know that there are some writers I've talked to a lot who get to a point where they can't go. They can't go. They can't write anymore. I talked to a mystery writer not too long ago. She's very successful in what she does, and she says she can't wait to get up in the morning to find out what the characters are going to do that day. And yet there are times in her writing experience when she gets up and she just can't go any farther. She just can't think of what to say or do with those characters that day. And she says that she just waits a few days and something will come up, kick off, clue in, kick in, and cause her to see the whole rest of the story. I guess that I have to acknowledge that it does exist, but I haven't experienced it myself.
Any advice for aspiring writers?
Keep writing. Keep writing. Some people ask me all the time, young people, how can I be a writer? I really think I'd like to be one. And they say, what can I do? And I say, write. The best teachers are the ones who take an elementary school person or middle school person and give them writing assignments. I think by the time they get to high school, in English classes, they ought to be asked to do something, write something new and original. Original is the key every day. I don't care about what other people think. If I were teaching, I'd say, tell me what you think. Write to me what you're thinking right now. Judge it on that. And if the person will do it, hey, some of the stuff will be bad at the beginning, but it will be tremendous later if they'll stay with it.
Let me ask you one further question.
All right.
How do you feel about ebooks as compared to printed books?
I guess they're a necessary part of where we are. I prefer a hard copy in front of me. And I have read some really good books, ebooks, and then I want to go back to them, and I'm not very good at flipping those electronic pages and going back and finding where I was. That I remember that one passage I wanted to read again, or I thought I wanted to check out over again, and can't find it. I could do that with a book if I have the hard copy in front of me.
Well, one final question.
Yes, sir.
Are you working on any projects currently?
Oh, my. I have two books stirring around. One is called Great Scots of Brooks County, which is my home county, and it was founded by Scottish immigrants in the early 1800s, and they were Presbyterians. So they built a beautiful edifice down there that you will not find in any other community in Georgia of 5,000 people or less. It's just a gorgeous, magnificent building with Tiffany stained glass in it, and it had an organ at one time that was half of which was bought by Andrew Carnegie when they put it in. That story is in the works, as well as another one I'm calling Decisions. Title of the book is Decisions. And it's about decisions that have been made in time that have changed the course of man. You know, I keep thinking, my favorite scientist was Nikola Tesla. And he was the guy who was in favor of alternating current as opposed to Thomas Edison, who thought DC current. Can you imagine what kind of lighting we'd have today if we were trying to make DC current work? Tesla won that contest, that argument with his colleague Edison, because he thought if we go with alternating current, we can deliver more power, more amperage to the customer, and that will be what they want. Tesla also had the idea of putting the electricity in the ionosphere so it would be available free to everyone all over the world. And obviously the power companies didn't like that idea, delivering free electricity. So it didn't work. But he was unable to continue his experimentation because the power company folks who funded him pulled their funding. But it's scientific decisions, it's political decisions, I guess. And I don't know where it's going to go from there. I've just started to work on it, and nothing has been written down yet. We'll see.
Well, it's been a real pleasure talking with you.
So good to see you again.
And good luck to you in your future writing career.
Thank you, Bob.
Please don't stop.
I don't plan to until the pen drops out of my hand. Thank you.
Thank you.